So hello everyone at the Inter 22 conference. We are on Zoom and we are having a chat with Professor Williamson from Wales, who has spent his professional career studying youth work and developing European youth policy. Not everyone in Finland knows non-formal education is, so can you briefly walk us through what non-formal education is and why that matters? Why is it important to use that concept in the European context?
It's not just Finland, Tommy, it's throughout the world. Nobody really knows what non-formal education is. And one of our challenges is to persuade people what it is and that it has value and meaning for young people. And I think part of the problem is that within youth work debates and circles, people talk about non-formal learning, they talk about informal learning, they talk about non-formal education. So there's so many words, even in the English language alone, trying to depict what goes on. And I was asked not so long ago, actually, to do a short YouTube video, 4 minutes long, to try to tell the world what it was all about. And I always call it non-formal education and learning. And I try to describe this as a big space between schooling and further and higher education, the formal education arena, and the communities in which young people live. And non-formal education is more akin to formal education with a teacher, if you like, but somebody who also gives more space, more participation, more dialogue, more partnership with young people than perhaps happens in many schools in many parts of the world. But there's also a non-formal learning dimension to non-formal education and learning, which is responding as a facilitator or an enabler to the informal learning that young people experience every day of their lives. If you're working with them, all kinds of accidental learning takes place. And part of the role of the non-formal educator or non-formal facilitator of non-formal learning is to help young people translate and transfer that accidental learning to the wider context of their lives. So put simply, I try to say that on the one hand, non-formal education is aligned with formal education, but the methodology is different. And on the other hand, non-formal learning is aligned with community education, but the methodology is different. And non-formal education and learning sits in a large space between the formal structures of education and the informal learning environments of communities.
I think for us Finns, the idea of youth work being non-formal education, it's quite easy to get that, because after the Second World War, when we were creating our youth work structures, we always thought that youth work is about education, it's about growth, it's about learning, it's about development. And we try to distance ourselves from social work. And sometimes when you talk to Finnish youth workers, it surprises them to hear that in a lot of the youth work cultures in Europe, youth work is actually closer to social work than to the world of education. So based on your studies and the evaluated work you have done, can you explain these two different youth work cultures? One, where youth work is closer to social work, and those cultures like Finland, which tend to see youth work as being about education or about development?
Well, of course, most statements about youth work will always talk about that youth work contributes to the personal development of young people. That might be learning, that might be therapeutic, it might be responding to some of the pathologies in their lives. I don't think it's a separation. I think there's a tension between the educative dimensions of youth work and the social work dimensions of youth work. But if the practice is fundamentally about education and learning, the policy imperative for supporting youth work tends to derive from social work issues. If we don't argue that there is a role to play, and most youth work evidence does suggest that there is a role for youth work to play in what is known as personal change, so that if you're working with more marginalized, more excluded young people who are involved in crime and drugs and dysfunctional families and so on, you can help them to think through their lives in ways that may then lead to certain kinds of positional change away from crime, away from drugs, into education, into positive activities. So I think these things overlap, and we have to think about how we articulate those in different contexts, because if we tell the politicians that it's a sort of only an educational practice, then social welfare politicians, criminal justice politicians will not be interested in youth work. So I don't think these two things should be separated. I see them as together, but not necessarily always in harmony. There's always a tension between the two.
A lot of youth workers, when in Finland we are debating about youth work identity, at some point they will say that they are not social workers and they don't want to go towards these problem-oriented or defensive-based approaches. We want to talk about what young people have to offer, what possibilities they offer to society, and what possibilities there are open for them. So it's a bit of an identity thing with the Finns. I briefly sent you some of the current policy issues in Finland, and one of them that is really important for youth workshops is the social and health services reform. And before the reform, usually youth workshops were organized by municipalities, and now it's a really difficult issue. And a lot of the work that has rehabilitative nature will be done by regions or by counties, if you want to use that term. And it changes the way youth workshops probably are organized in different parts of Finland. And one of the things Finnish youth workers have to think is the relationship between social work and youth work, and health services and youth work. And that sort of puts us in a new situation. So based on your experience, what advice or points of view would you give to Finnish youth work community? What questions should we be asking, and what points should we take into account?
It's a tough question. I do recall that the Council of Europe, that's the 47 countries, not the EU 27, the Council of Europe's first youth policy review was of Finland, as some people will know, 25 years ago. And, you know, you have held on to a particular principle of youth policy more generally, which is you want it to be positive and opportunity focused, but you also expect young people to take it up. And that was the kind of Finnish model. And the Minister of Culture, Klaus Andersen, was very adamant that that was what it was about. The workshops were quite interesting because I didn't really understand them when I first went to one. I've still got some wall hanging things that were made by young people in these workshops. And funny, when you're traveling with hand luggage on a plane, you don't really want 4 cast iron wall hangings to carry around with you, but that's what we got. And my colleagues gave them all to me, and I've still got them all. I brought them home. And I thought the workshops were very much vocational training. I saw them very akin to many of the programs and projects that I'd researched in the UK following the rise in youth unemployment in the late 70s and early 80s. And then people said, no, they're part of youth work. So I think there's a bit of a paradox in your observations, Tommy, that youth work is educational. It doesn't want to be connected to problems. No, we don't want youth work connected to problems. We want an opportunity-focused youth policy. And in Wales, we have developed that to some extent, and we're quite proud of that. We cannot escape the fact that youth work is always pointed towards more challenging young people, those who are excluded from education, those who may be struggling with family relationships, and therefore perhaps under the gaze of social work or psychology or psychiatry, young people who, we have youth work in hospitals with young people with long-term medical conditions to try to help their transition to adult medical services. And your outreach work, which I believe most people attending this event, are part of, is also about bringing young people, who've dropped out of mainstream pathways to adulthood and the labour market. So I find it slightly perplexing to proclaim that youth work wants to remain somehow detached from those things. I've always argued that if youth work's so damn important to young people's lives, then the young people facing the most difficulties and challenges in their lives must not be denied youth work opportunities and a youth work offer. In fact, we need to make more effort to reach them and take it to them. But we have to think about where our lines are drawn, that we don't want to become the servants of the Youth Employment Service. We don't want to become the servants of social services. We don't want to become the servants of housing initiatives. We want to retain some kind of autonomy. And, your colleagues, Lasse Syrjälä and Lena Surpa, were the co-editors of Volume 4 of the History of Youth Work in Europe, which was called Autonomy Through Dependency. And it was about the importance of youth work forging partnerships with other agencies responsible for young people's lives. Having said that, I emphasize the word partnership, not enslavement. It's not about subordinating youth work to the agendas of others. It's about genuinely working together and bringing youth work skills and youth work possibilities to the table for those sorts of young people. And if youth work, and I'm sorry to say this, but my global youth policy experience is that where youth work tries to proclaim its grand autonomy and freedom from any of those sort of social control aspects of their practice, they will be dismissed as irrelevant by politicians. But of course, the problem for young people is that they speak more truthfully to youth workers because they trust that youth workers could or should be in a position to provide the support that they need or want. And of course, youth workers don't have those resources and don't have that capacity. Youth workers usually have to refer young people on to employment services or social services or other educational services or psychological services and so on. I once wrote a book called Children Speak, and it was how young people stop talking to any professionals. They talk to cuddly toys and their pets because they feel that adults generally, including youth workers sometimes, either over-exaggerate or trivialize their concerns. And what they want people to do is check back with them the action that they would like the professional to take. And too many professionals, sometimes through legal obligation, they hear things and they have to act on it, whether the young person wants it or not. And that destroys trust and belief, and it destroys the capacity of services to actually make positive interventions in young people's lives.
One of the key trends, I think, in Finnish youth work is the increased multi-professional cooperation. So clearly, Finnish youth work is quite professionalized, and a lot of the NGOs operate on a voluntary basis. And there are some tensions right now in the youth field. There is sort of the move towards sort of a professionalized world of social workers and teachers and police officers and youth workers. And that means sort of the move away from the volunteers and all. So when you're looking at Finnish youth work community, which is and tries to be professionalized, how would you see the issue between professional and voluntary youth work?
There's a lot of questions in that, Tommy. There's a lot of points that you're making. I mean, you started off talking about kind of collaborative work with other agencies, multi-professional practice, I think you called it, and it's called many different things, interagency work. And I've always described that. I wrote a report nearly 40 years ago now saying that this all rested on a precarious equilibrium. That was my concept or my term. And it was a precarious equilibrium of organizational, professional, and personal relationships. So it was, sometimes you can get some really good multi-professional work, not because the professions work well together, but because the people like each other. They see merit in collaboration. And sometimes organizational collaboration is the important sort of glue that binds the professional practice together. So there's different ways of doing it, but it's always a bit flimsy and a bit fragile. And that links to a second point, which is I do a lecture called Cherished Values or Sacred Cows about youth work, which is, you know, youth workers bang on about the voluntary relationship. They bang on about working holistically with young people. There are these kinds of core principles about empowerment and being educational, being participative, being empowering. They use all of these words. And my challenge has always been to youth workers about what is so central to the value base of your practice that if you give it up, you are no longer a youth worker. And what is actually disposable in the 21st century? What might we get rid of? Or what might we want to redefine or think through differently? You know, youth work in schools, is that a kind of voluntary relationship? Youth work in criminal justice settings for young people, custodial institutions. Now, those are different questions from the other one that you kind of wove into your commentary and question about professionalization. Professionalization makes a great deal of sense about strengthening professional practice, but it doesn't make a lot of sense that most countries in the world, youth work is largely delivered by volunteers, good-willed people working in evenings and on weekends. Finland is an outlier. It's an exception with a strong body of professional practitioners. And we have to be extremely careful about over-professionalizing and somehow diminishing the value and the contribution of volunteers. Having said that, you need a professional infrastructure to ensure that the practice of that large army of volunteers is conducted professionally. We want voluntary youth workers to make sure that they are operating in a safe environment for young people, the whole safeguarding agenda. We want volunteers to be doing youth work, you know, creating environments where young people learn, not just sort of offering tourist opportunities for young people by taking them canoeing or taking them climbing hills or whatever it might be. So we want volunteers to understand what youth work is meant to be about and enable them to deliver it better. But I think we have to be very careful about this concept of professionalization, because with professionalization comes a lot of compromises that a lot of youth workers are unwilling to make, and particularly youth workers in the NGO sector.
Well, the declaration of the Second Youth Work Convention, I think it used two really good metaphors, mainly creating spaces for young people, for them to interact and to have fun, and then building bridges towards society, towards the education system, the whole transition thing. Creating spaces, building bridges. What do those metaphors mean? I think I had the impression that you were actually behind those ideas pretty much.
Well, was I behind them? I don't know. I think they certainly were two cornerstones of my own youth work practice. You know, I think the very first article I ever wrote was called Pubs Without Beer, which was, you know, my youth center was a space where young people came and hung around, and it was warm and it was light and they could play their music and meet their friends. And I was sort of just, you know, the coffee bar man and the opening the doors at 7:30 in the evening till 10 o'clock at night. But of course, you know, the building bridges was getting to know those young people, and when they expressed interest in certain things, or when I felt that they might be curious about some college course or something else, I could support them in moving in those directions, those purposeful and positive directions. The argument about spaces and bridges, I think, is deeply felt by most people who are youth workers. I think they recognize it. We probably lean towards the spaces rather than the bridges, because we believe that we are there to give young people autonomy and time, and patience and understanding, on their patch, on their turf, as the declaration says somewhere else. But that's going to be a political non-starter in terms of winning support for youth work. Politicians are going to say, well, if they want to hang around somewhere, let them hang around somewhere. Politicians want to know how youth work is contributing to young people staying on the positive track in their lives. Now, the worry is that we end up becoming sort of employment specialists for young people. It's not about employability. And I've always been very insistent that the declaration was about the positive next steps in those young people's lives, whether that was playing the guitar or walking up a hill or getting involved in a local club of some kind. It could be many, many different things, but it's helping them to take those stepping stones. And I think we needed to have a statement like that. Sadly, the youth work field immediately starts arguing and fighting about concepts and definitions. And yeah, we should have those discussions internally, but externally, we look like a bunch of, ragged clowns who all have our own ideas and we don't share them. And if we don't share them, the clock stops and we don't persuade politicians that youth work is an important part of the mosaic of opportunity in young people's lives.
Well, that's one of the things that may be hard for Finnish youth workers to understand. In Finland, we don't really talk about radical youth work. And of course, Nordic societies in general, they believe in the state. And they think that state has a lot of good things to offer. I mean, even right-wing politicians in Finland say that. So working with the states, working with our officials, well, it's quite easy for us to do that. Maybe in the 90s and early noughties, we had that attitude. We are there for young people and only us, and they are opposed to cuts and to teachers and to other actors of adult society, which are going to put a lot of emphasis on social control instead of liberation and all that.
I think it's a kind of, false mission to make these distinctions between, social control and emancipation. I think, the history of youth work is about the relationship between those two things. And, Philip Cousset and myself have written about working class kids tended to have regulatory youth work and middle class kids tended to have emancipatory youth work, because the former group were the troublesome villains and the latter group were the important, valued members of youthful society. But actually, youth work is always a balance of regulation and emancipation. And we want to try and lean towards emancipation, giving young people autonomy and space and decision-making power, the power being an important word. But equally, youth work is also about explaining to young people that when you are moving forward in your life, there are certain things that might be wise to keep your mouth shut about and to be a bit more compliant. I mean, I'm trying to think how many, again, it was probably 40 years ago, I gave a big speech to the local government association around the time when Margaret Thatcher was very, very keen on enterprise education, making young people entrepreneurial in schools. And I was asked to do this speech. And I said, the real challenge for education, any form of education, formal or non-formal, is helping young people to work out when it's important to be enterprising, showing initiative and so on, and when it's important to be compliant and, if you like, obedient. And if young people get it wrong, or we fail to educate young people in making that kind of judgment call, then the enterprising kids, when they need to be compliant, will get thrown out of the door for being too cheeky. And the compliant kids, when they need to be enterprising, will get left behind. So we have to think about helping, we all do it. Us educated, middle-aged or older people have become very skilled at doing that sort of thing. But somehow we want to, liberate young people. And it's a difference between socialization and education. Education is a great thing, but it's not great for fitting into social networks and social contexts. Not always.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm always reminded that it's really hard to be a bohemian in Finland, because during the winter time you will freeze your ass off if you don't have a permanent housing. So being in good terms with the state and getting some money for your housing, that's generally advisable in Finland compared to some other countries where you don't die, basically. I've always wanted to ask you this, but I didn't really have the courage. So I will ask it. I will ask it now. So what kept you going? I mean, what is it about youth work that's really so very important to you?
I think for me, it was the diversity of activity that kept me going. I didn't mind wearing a suit on a Thursday daytime in Brussels, but I literally flew back to Birmingham in the evening and drove straight to a youth centre and ran a youth club. And some of those young people would say, why are you wearing a tie? And that was an opportunity to tell them, well, you know, sometimes you have to, sometimes that's expected of you, and that's okay. You know, it was a basis for discussion with young people. And although I'd been up at 5 o'clock in the morning to fly to Brussels and work through lots of paperwork and meetings and so on, I still had the energy at 10:30 at night to be talking to young people in the youth centre. And I took their words and their thinking into the policy debate. And I took the policy debate back to them to see what they thought of it. And I studied it in the university and I taught students about it. And you're right. I mean, you know, it was my birthday last week, and I do keep thinking I should retire. And everybody asks me, the first thing they ever say is, why haven't you retired yet? Or, are you going to retire? When are you going to retire? And I don't feel ready to do so yet. I'm still very motivated to, and I am actually, I guess I should finish with this, because some of your colleagues listening to this might be thinking, well, you know, he's good at talking, isn't he? He's okay, but he's a professor in a university and comfortable life. First thing I did when COVID broke out, exactly 2 years ago, I flew back from Zagreb, and the first thing I did was ring up the local authority and said, I'm a nationally qualified youth worker. Is there anything I could do? And I got appointed with a essential worker pass in lockdown, so I could be outside. I got appointed as a COVID-19 community resilience youth support worker. And that was my title. I have a piece of paper with that written on it. And I didn't do much, but I did a little bit. And it was a test of whether I could still be a practicing youth worker. And I found that I could still build a link with young people, have a conversation, connect with their interests, their concerns, and provide them with some level of support. And you may know the little video I did for the 3rd European Youth Work Convention. I said there were 3 S's about youth work, about stretch their imaginations and their experiences. It was about support, and it was about, you know, young people need support from time to time, and youth work's in a good position to offer modest support, nothing too long-term and too detailed, and space, and give young people space to be themselves and express their views.
That's a lovely way to end this conversation: stretch, support, and space. So thank you, Howard. It's been a pleasure. You can't really retire because we expect you to be in Finland live. This was a recorded conversation. The next time, hopefully, it will be live. So at least until that, do not retire.
I must finish to say thank you to you, Tomi, for all your contribution, because you've been a brilliant friend and colleague for a long time. I feel I'm an honorary Finn sometimes. You're a bit like a brother to me. So thanks for that. Thank you.
I'm really touched by those words. Thank you, Howard. Yeah.